All right, so are you ready to dive deep into data organization?
Always ready to get organized.
Well, our researchers are looking for the absolute best ways to organize their data. We're going to cover everything from file naming conventions to folder structures.
And don't forget version control.
How could we? It's essential. We'll even touch on why version number might just be a lifesaver for file names because who wants to deal with the draft final revision, really final?
Exactly nightmare. A well-organized system can be a real game changer, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Think about it. It saves time, reduces frustration, and can even prevent data loss.
No more searching for that one crucial file for hours on end.
Right, we've all been there.
So, let's start with the basics of file names. What makes it a good file name?
A good file name should be clear. It tells you what's in a file at a glance and when it was created.
Like clearly labeling stuff in my closet?
Exactly. You can use things like a project acronym, content description, file type, date, creator name or initial, and version number.
Okay, but how do we put it all together? Is there a magic formula?
Well, you can think of it like this. Each file name should have a clear structure. Let's say a researcher MZ conducting an interview on March 10th, 2024, which is a part of airborne exposures to semi-volatile organic pollutant study. The file name could be ESOP MZ interview results 2024 310 XLSX, where ESOP is the project acronym, MZ is the researcher's initial, interview results are content description, and 2024 310 is the date.
Perfect example. So anyone looking at that file will know exactly which project it belongs to, who created it, what it's about, and when it's created. That's brilliant.
Isn't it? It's the ISO standard for the date format using year, month, date, and it helps avoid confusion. No more wondering if 0310 means March 10th or October 3rd.
Okay, but can you talk more about underscores in the example?
Ah, yes, they're basically a way to separate logical elements in a file name. You should avoid spaces because not all computer systems can handle spaces in file names. To make file names both computer and human readable, use dashes, underscores, or capitalize the first letter of each word in the file names.
So, is there a right or wrong way to choose between them, or is it just personal preference?
It often comes down to personal preference or maybe project guidelines. The key is to pick one style and stick with it. Consistency is key. One more tip, you should reserve file extensions such as .doc and .xlsx if possible. All right, let's test our newfound file naming best practices with some examples of good and bad file names. What do you think, good or bad?
That one is good. It follows the structure. It is clear, concise, and easy to understand.
Good job. Okay, next up, what are your thoughts?
Oh no, that's a recipe for disaster. The multiple finals are a clear sign of trouble.
Yeah, and there's no date. We need that timestamp.
Absolutely.
All right, one last challenge, good or bad?
Hmm. That ampersand is a bit suspicious. Special characters can sometimes cause problems with different computer systems. Better to stick with letters, numbers, underscores, and dashes.
You're like a file naming detective. Now we need to talk about how these perfectly named files actually live together, right?
Yes, we need to talk about folder structures.
Imagine you're working on a huge project. Files are scattered everywhere, desktop, downloads folder, you name it.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling.
6 months later, you need one specific file.
Panic.
Exactly. Yeah, you can avoid that panic with a good folder structure. So it's not just about naming the files well, it's about where they live too. Think of it like organizing your house. You would throw everything in one giant pile, would you?
Okay, that makes sense.
You can organize files and folders by project name, researcher name, date, research notebook number, sample number, experiment or instrument, file type, and research activity.
But how do we actually make it work? Where do we start?
Well, one way is to follow the flow of your work. Say you're on a research project. You'd have a main folder for the project itself, then subfolders for each phase like data collection, analysis, and reports.
So, it's like those Russian nesting dolls, each folder containing smaller, more specific folders.
I like that analogy.
But what about inside those subfolders? How do we organize the actual files?
Well, that's where the researcher experiment and file type come in. Let's say in your data collection folder, you could have subfolders for each researcher. Then within each researcher's folder, organized by experiment or by file type.
So many layers of folders. Can you give an example?
Sure, UK Data Service provides this really cool example. As you see, within the project folder, data and documentation files are held in separate folders. Data files are organized based on data type and then research activity. Documentation files are organized also according to the documentation type and research activity.
I love it. It just makes finding things so much easier.
Exactly. Imagine trying to find data from a specific research activity with that folder structure. Boom, you know exactly where to look.
Okay, I'm starting to see the light, but there's still one piece of this data organization puzzle that kind of scares me.
What's that?
Version control. I've had so many moments where I'm like, wait, which version is the right one?
I feel you. Version control is like having a time machine for your file. You can track changes, go back to older versions, and never worry about accidentally overwriting something important.
That sounds amazing, but how do we actually do it?
There are a few different ways, including putting dates in file names, using version numbers, and even file version control tables. Okay, let's break it down. The simplest way is to include the date right in the file name, like this example. It's great for basic tracking, but it can get a bit messy if you have multiple versions from the same day. For those situations, version numbers are your friend. You can add V1, V2, and so on to distinguish different versions. If version number is not enough for you, you can even add revision numbers like V1, R1.
Straightforward.
Now, if you want to go all out, file version control tables are amazing. It's basically a spreadsheet that tracks every tiny change made to a file.
So, like a super detailed change log for my file.
Exactly. Here's an example of COVID-19 PCR tests in ISIC schools, and their file history table is seriously impressive. They documented every single change, who made it, and the date.
Wow, that's intense.
It might be a bit much for every project, but it shows just how powerful version control can be. Make sure everyone on the team has the most up-to-date file.
No more accidentally saving over the wrong file.
Exactly.
So, in addition to those we've just talked about, are there any other version control tips we should know?
Definitely. You need to decide how many versions of a file to keep, which versions to keep, for how long, and how to organize versions. Make sure to label those milestone versions clearly and, of course, consistent naming conventions for those versions. And don't forget, there are tools out there that can make version control even easier, like Git, GitHub, and some file sharing platforms like OneDrive for Business.
This can be super helpful, especially for big projects with many collaborators.
Exactly. Since we've covered so much today, what's the main takeaway for you?
For me, it's so satisfying to finally identify some practical tips for getting my data organized.
Great. So, to wrap things up, I want to leave you with a challenge. Maybe adopt a consistent file naming convention or create a new folder structure for that project you're working on, or even just evaluate your current folder structure so you can start to see where you can improve. And that's our deep dive into the world of data organization.
We
We
hope
hope
you
you
enjoyed it
enjoyed it
and
and
learned some
learned some
tips.
tips.